start in Galatians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 6. This is a passage that for a lot of people is troublesome in grace, and it's because they misunderstand the context. And Paul, I'll give you the heads up before you begin, Paul is talking to the Galatian church about giving in grace. And he says this, let him who is taught the word, this is Galatians 6:6. I said 5, I'm sorry. Galatians 6:6. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. You notice that's troublesome for some people in grace, because they read that verse and they take it through the lens of performance, and they say, if you do bad, you're going to get bad, and if you do good, you're going to get good. And they'll say, now what do you grace people do with this verse? How do you deal with that? Paul believed that whatever you sow, you're going to reap. But notice that the lead-in verse was that if someone teaches you the word, you ought to share with the one that's teaching you. And then look at the next verse, verse 8. He who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let's not grow weary while we're doing good. What good are we doing? Well, according to the context, we're sowing into those who are doing good in our lives. Don't grow weary while you're doing good, because in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let's do good to all, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. I don't want to preach on giving, but this is ready-made. This is the Apostle Paul saying to the Galatian Christians, if you're being taught good things, you by default ought to automatically give back in to the teacher. You ought to automatically give back in to whoever drops the seed into your heart. If they're going to have any more seed in the bag, someone's going to have to supply. And so Paul says you ought to be the one doing that. He says, first and foremost, you ought to be doing that to everyone around you, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. And he says, don't worry, just because you're sowing in, maybe you're not seeing a return, don't worry. Continue to sow in to the good news. You will reap. If you faint not, you'll reap in due season. Now, what God doesn't tell you is when that season is. Right. Paul doesn't bother to say, now it'll be 6 months, it'll be 8 months, it'll be a year, it'll be 2 years, 5 years, 10. He doesn't say, because it's never specific in the realm of the Spirit. God doesn't have to, because remember, to God, time's not that important, but timing is important. Right. So for God, it's not about 10 straight Sundays you give or you do or you go, and then you're blessed. Or give this exact dollar amount. No, it's in due season, the Lord doing what He does. Now that Paul, there's a long way we can go with giving, and Paul does a lot of great stuff in his writings, particularly 2 Corinthians, and there's a lot of things we can get into. But I want you to notice that there's a season in which we reap if we faint not. I don't know why sometimes the season seems delayed. I don't know why sometimes we don't walk right into the season. But I've determined in my own walk not to argue with God about when, about where, about why, about how, but just to accept that as long as I am continuing to walk in Him, I can believe that we're going to reap in due season if we faint not. And I notice that one of the things we receive is everlasting life. And so I believe that one of the beautiful things, someone could say this is chasing a rabbit, a little bit of a side note, but he's got to be chased because I saw him jump. And I believe that God, who is outside of time, He has placed us into this, and we're time-bound. Whether we like it or not, we're time-bound. It's actually the most valuable thing that we have in our lives, because you can get to your deathbed, anybody get to their deathbed and have money left over in the bank, they would tell you, I would give every dime I have for one more day. I'd give every dime I have for one more week, one more month, one more year. Why? Because time's way more important than money. And we're all time-bound. Every one of us have always said, I don't have enough time, even though every one of us has the exact same amount of time as everyone else. Notice that? Right. And have you also noticed we have time to do everything we want to do? That's true. Even though we don't have time, we have time. We make time to do every single thing in our life that we really want to do. So while time is essential to us, to the timeless one, to God, it's fascinating to me that God offers to the believer a taste of eternity. He says you'll have eternal life. Remember this, under the Old Covenant, the promise that God made to the adherents of the Old Covenant, I am the God that healeth thee. And He provided for them The promise of the old covenant, I am the God that healeth thee. I believe that's why Jesus comes healing the sick right and left. Because it's the physical manifestation of what the Jews thought they were going to receive under the old covenant. What did God say? I am the God that healeth thee. So every town Jesus goes in, boom, 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 he's healing the sick. He's even really reluctant to heal the Gentile. You ever wonder, we go, well, he only came for the Jew. He did. He came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But why? Because the manifestation of the old covenant to them was healing. It didn't mean as much to the Gentile for healing. And so Jesus says in John 3 to Nicodemus that for God so loved the world, most famous verse in the New Testament, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus is introducing you to the results of the new covenant. To a Jewish mindset who had results of the old covenant as healing, Jesus comes along and says, but under the new covenant, what I'm going to give you is not just healing. Now that doesn't mean I don't believe in healing, but I don't believe healing was what God's purpose was under the new covenant. I believe God's purpose under the new covenant was so that the timeless one could come alive inside of time-bound people. So that people who are trapped to the clock could live free and know that what is theirs now and forever is everlasting life. And so the new covenant provided you with something the old covenant could never provide you, everlasting. And how many of you know that if you have everlasting life, even if you are to die on this earth, whatever disease or sickness might take you, in the moment that you slip off this body, you walk into the full manifestation of your eternal life, and you don't drag your sickness into eternity. So isn't it amazing that under the new covenant, even if it looks like sickness and disease wins, everlasting life wins. You still get the fulfillment of the old covenant inside of the new covenant because you have the everlasting life of God. So I think it's fascinating that God, although we are time-bound, provides a way for us to enjoy and indulge ourselves in the everlasting one.